So you grow in Quebec at Tournesol Farm. What do you think is the particular value of learning how to breed plants on farm for folks who are in Eastern Canada, Atlantic Canada?
By breeding and selecting in different climates, you're adapting to them. And so we'll definitely see crops get earlier just by being selected for. And then and like, because breeding is broad, right? As a topic, breeding can be, I take two different things and cross it to get a lot of genetic diversity and select out something different or something that looks similar but is different. Or I can just take, a pepper and grow 200 plants of it and choose the best 10 or 15 and do that over and over. So those are both breeding. And people tend to think of the other one more as plant breeding. But just the process that we do as seed keepers and as seed farmers of growing a larger population and then choosing the better ones, that's also breeding. And so things get earlier. Things, if you pay attention, you can have things that are more disease resistant. And then also cold hardiness. I think those are three things that we can really select for. Um, the potential has to exist within the gene pool that you're working with, but generally you'll go in that direction. And then if you're crossing very different varieties together, you have even more potential for that. So I think that's one thing that's really exciting. And then the other part is creating varieties that is distinctly yours and that become part of your farm story and that you can share on social media, you can put in your newsletter, you can talk about our market, you can talk about with your CSA clients. And I think that is really so it could be looked as a marketing niche of having something that's different, but it's also just a way to tell your story another way. And I think that's a real value that can strengthen your farm even more than more adapted seeds can.
What do you think is the biggest issue facing farmer plant breeders right now?
I've got two issues. One is more of an outside issue and like the larger context, and it's I think we're on the cusp of genetic engineering or so many varieties being available with that to home gardeners with genetically engineered genes. And the one that there's a purple tomato that came out from it's called from Norfolk Plant Sciences in the last 2 years, and it's like it's gorgeous. It's like I think it's Snapdragon genes that they use, and it's like purple. It's not like a black. It's not like what we call purple, but it's purple.
Actually,
So
I've seen pictures of it. It's actually purple. Yeah.
yeah, and so this is something that um, you could come home, take to your house, and you can start saving the seed and sharing it everywhere. And I think, and I've seen on online forums people want to start doing breeding projects with it, and so these genes start to emerge into the population, and I think we're going to see more and more of that. So I mean, and maybe you don't care. Maybe that's like, yes, I can't wait to have more purple tomatoes, no matter how they're there. But if you're concerned about this, just the spreading of genetically engineered genes, and you want to preserve OPs, open pollinated varieties, like I think this is something that's going to take more attention to be paid to the stuff the varieties you're working with, and it's something that kind of freaks me out. I'm very curious what's going to happen, but I think things are going to change. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is or issue is more related to your farm, and I think to get the best results you have to grow a lot of plants, and when you grow a lot of plants you see more diversity and you see more chance of seeing exceptional individuals. And if you have 1 or 2 acres of farm, it's hard to go and grow 200 or 300 pepper plants or 1,000 radishes um, and so that can be a challenge that can limit the potential you have unless you have a market for it. So if you like with these radishes, all the off types can go into a CSA basket. Like
Yeah.
we eat them. They're not, so it's no wasted space. There is a lot of seed that gets produced at different parts in this, but in terms of the vegetables, like there's not really wasted space that happens with that. And like we do a lot of pepper breeding projects, and again, we can move the peppers through. So that's the other issue I think that farmers have is or farmer plant breeders is how to find a way to grow enough plants that makes financial sense on your farm in 1 year and in many years. I mean, sometimes just growing a lot of plants 1 year is fine, and then you can have a smaller amount. But often growing more plants every year is just going to help you out.
Dan, what piece of advice would you give to a grower embarking on their very first plant breeding project, or perhaps someone who has an idea for a plant breeding project but isn't quite sure how to approach it yet?
Um, I think my advice is like someone who's just a little bit into the project. It's not necessarily the getting started, but the kind of the next steps, or maybe a little bit the getting started. So, and I have two pieces again of advice, and one is think about how you're going to evaluate if you see what you want, and like you could have an idea what for a plant breeding project, but you need to be able to see if it's going in that direction. So, like with these radishes that we showed, to get to see if I cut it in half, the radish is not going to be able to continue growing. So if I want to see the inside of what the colors and I cut it all the way through, it's going to stop growing. If it was a carrot, it would keep growing because carrots is an actual true root, whereas radishes are stem tissue. So I kind of cut a slit in to see, and I have to go deep enough to see. So that's kind of like a plan of how I want to see what's happening. With the squash again, like if I have 300 squash, I'm going to have to cut them all and see the inside of what they look like to evaluate them. And if you love eating squash and you eat hundreds of squash through the winter, well then maybe you just bring them in and you want to mark each squash individually from what plant it came from, and then you cook it. If it tastes great, you keep the seed, and you can also see how long it stores. But you have to have a strategy of how you're going to do it. And the other thing is, you will likely begin to see you have 1 million choices you can make. And you need to know how to make choices and narrow down the selections. And so I showed some radish picture, or so the radish picture, there's probably at least 8 different phenotypes in there and maybe more. So I could have taken 8 breeding projects. And then
Mm.
as they start to stabilize, maybe I'll see even more coming out of it, and I don't have enough space to do all of that or enough time. And it's something I had a problem with lettuces. I was doing some lettuce crosses about 15 years ago, and I'd crossed a red oak leaf with a what was the other one? It was a small green something. I can't remember what it was, but I got so much diversity, and it was like there were 30 or 40 different plants that didn't look like anything else, and how to keep them. And ultimately I gave up on the lettuce because it overwhelmed me. I think now I went back and that seed no longer germinates, and I was disappointed. Now I'm more equipped. And the things I would look at, is the taste. Does it taste good? I would probably try to grow, if I was in early years of a lettuce breeding, I would grow it probably outdoors so there's more disease pressure. And I would really look at what does well disease wise. And then
Yeah.
in terms of things different, I would really look for what I find stunning, not just what I find like quirky or interesting, and so and that's, I think, when you're becoming a farmer plant breeder, part of the journey is learning about how to be judicious. At first, it's going to be hard to know how to make that choices, and you're going to keep more stuff than you can manage. And but over time, you start making decisions and start seeing, maybe I really didn't really want to keep that. It's not that great. Why did I grow it for 4 years? And 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 you get better at shutting projects down and just keeping less lines. And that's a really important thing, is learn how to make those choices. I've heard in writing the expression "kill your darlings." It's just, and so I think that goes for this case too. And I think it's better to grow something, with a larger population size that you really love, than a lot of small things with small population sizes that you don't care that much about, other than the fact that they're new and exciting. So all the seeds that we sell, you can find on what is our website? fermetonlecel.qc.ca. If you search Tournesol, you'll find us. So we do sell the seeds, but I have a book coming up called The Seed Farmer, and I do talk about some of these breeding projects and other breeding stuff. And I also host a podcast called The Seed Farmer, where I talk with other seed growers and farmers about, about growing seed, but also their breeding projects. So I think the viewers should go out and check those things out.
What do you think the rationale or importance or extra challenge is for growers in our regions to engage in plant breeding work?
What I've found is that varieties that I like disappear because they're not breeding for my climate. So there's hybrids that I really enjoy, and then they've replaced them with something else, and that quote new thing is nowhere near as good for me in my latitude as the variety they dropped.
Mhm.
So that puts me in a position of like basically constantly scrambling for a variety, for finding the new variety, because their predication is not, they weren't really even breeding that first variety. It was just lucked out that it was for me. They weren't breeding it for my environment. It just happened to be that I was like, oh, this is the good one. And then, 5 years later or even less, sometimes by the time I find it, they get rid of it. So um, that for the sweet corn part of it is there's an ever evolving portfolio of hybrids, and we don't have any say in that and what's valuable. And varieties come and go for reasons that have nothing to do with whether they perform for us. So that put me in a position of wanting to take the varieties that I either had remnant seed of or that were still in the marketplace that I was worried were going to go away and start breeding with those and to capture those traits for myself and to basically be able to say, I consistently have this corn that's awesome for me. And the disease resistance of varieties that have been selected in our region really does matter. We get a lot more heat and humidity, and particularly the humidity and damp falls, and having good, strong, sturdy corn that can handle winds and also wet, windy conditions because we get these, storms that come through, hurricanes in August and September, are really important. And they're not really worried about that if they're breeding for, and just so everyone knows what they are breeding for, they're breeding for single pick varieties. They're breeding for folks that are selling mostly out of Georgia and Florida. So this is kind of the element of like, what are we up against? We're up against the fact that we're not the target audience, particularly in the Northeast and Atlantic Canada.
What guidance would you offer to a seed grower who has maybe identified a gap in the available seed, for what they need and would like to get into plant breeding, but hasn't done any of that specifically yet?
You kind of have to decide what your breeding objectives are. The truth is, what you really should be looking for is the best thing that comes out of the cross. What are the techniques that you're going to use to capture that Polaroid? And what I mean by that, it's like every season in a breeding process, you have a plant and it has certain traits, and you're trying to find the good ones. And what is your approach to say, that's my snapshot? And and whatever I'm doing here is going to help me move forward with maybe a better population. With some plants, you can use things like hand pollination or bagging flowers or things if it's a self-pollinating plant. But even if you're not doing that type of work where you're intervening in the pollination process, it's important, and this is where the land space thing is important. Sometimes it's fine in the first generation to be like, hey, this is the one that tastes good. And you just like have your squash and they're just all like running into each other and you can't really figure out where it came from. But you know that that one's pretty and or that one tastes good. And sometimes that's enough in the first generation or two. But when you get into like the second or third generation or fourth generation, you really want to know the traits of each plant in the population. And so that means tracing back to the mother root plant, transplant or whatever seedling, all of the fruits that come from that plant and bringing them forward. Because you might find one that's good, but then the other ones might be small and misshapen. Or it might be a plant that's produced two good fruits, and there's another one over here that has like six or eight that are all equally good. And you can't discern that if they're just running into each other or that if you're not taking the time to trace them all back. So even in a mass population model, you might find yourself needing to plant the plants farther apart. So in our model with squash, we've discovered that 6 feet apart in the row, and then quite a bit of space between the plants in between rows, I mean,
Mhm.
is helps us see what's going on. In open population stuff, you know the fruiting parent. In other words, if it's a fruit, you know that the pollen can't, that the fruit is on this vine. You don't know who the pollen parent is. So you know half the parentage. And so every year you're sort of selecting for half if you're just doing open pollinated work. And that's totally fine. The challenge is sometimes is that there's pesky, persistent, potentially negative things that are what we might call dominant genes or persistent genes that can overwhelm something that you really love.
Mm.
And this is sometimes where people give up is that they encounter something that keeps creating a negative return. And that's where things like hand pollination and getting away from the gene pool model or the open pollinated model can come into work in your breeding program.
I mean, in terms of a grower setting plant breeding goals and that quite long timeline for OP plant breeding, do you think that there's value in, or do you think that's part of the reason that this kind of land race sort of plant population management, like wider selections, has kind of come to the forefront a little bit? Like, is there, and are those wider selections more helpful in climate change than striving for a super consistent, quote unquote, finished variety?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think the answer is again, like how you select. If somebody continues to select a population and they're really clear, not clear, but they're really engaged in that, we're looking at the plant, the flavor, the disease resistance, whatever it is, um, then that population can be hundreds of times better and more beneficial than a set variety. Like I was saying to my friends at the crabapple farm, like they breed some squash, and every time they find a new winter squash that they like, that they think is tasty and productive, whether it's a hybrid or OP, they might fold it into their existing
Mm,
population. And so I think the concept of stopping any project or stopping breeding, and this is like you hand it to somebody else and they play with it and they have their own favorites, and that's really what OPs basically are. So either you can work in that diverse gene pool mode, which oddly enough in the conventional breeding model has a name. They call it synthetics. There's multiple parents creating basically an ongoing selected hybrid or an ongoing selected OP. It's a very weird name. I don't know why they came up with that. I think it has to do with the concept of like synthesizing multiple genes stacked on. But anyways, so the conventional version of this, of what we might call a gene pool breeding or this other word landrace, they have this word they call synthetic, and that's the same thing. What people really love on the conventional plant breeding model is they love creating those synthetics and then selecting individual plants out of them. That's how they create, that's how a lot of breeders really like to create their inbred lines or their new things, is
mhm,
mixing a bunch of things up, and they call it recombinant crossing. They take every single hybrid that's legal to play with and they create a big pool of them and they let them cross, and then they're doing that work, but they have a fancy word that they put on that work. So don't get yourself wrong that advanced breeding for disease resistance and performance, most breeders thinks the gold standard is to create a massive gene pool and select strong, awesome plants out of it and create inbred lines diverging from that, but always maintaining some kind of strong, crazy pool that you're playing with. So we're being told that inbreds are the way to go, but inbreds diverge from something. Somebody is doing what they call pre-breeding. However, they get to the inbred line, that's kind of moot. It's the fact that there's actually this thing so the value of that obviously has value, or they wouldn't be doing it. It's hard to communicate the tip of the iceberg of really wonderful, fun work.
yeah.
Because I think a lot of times it seems kind of complicated and daunting, and other times it's like you're worried you're going to get confused and misdirected. It's like all those things are true. But again, it comes down to I have two things I like, or more than two things. What happens if I play with these things? Or what's even more fun is sometimes you are just buying seed and you discover something random because there was an outcross in that seed production. And you go, whoa, this is cool. And how do you save seed from that and maybe play with it going forward? And I mean, those two things are about like 95% of where people who are doing plant breeding start. So that's like kind of the joy of plant breeding is when someone says, this is good. And you're like, yeah. And they're like, where'd you get this? Well, we're breeding it on our farm.